The bed was made. That was the first thing the servant noticed, not the absence of luggage, not the cleared windowsill, not the particular quality of stillness that a room acquires when the person who inhabited it has left with intention rather than haste. The bed was made with the careful, anonymous precision of someone who understood that they were leaving a space for the next occupant and had the consideration to prepare it. The servant stood in the doorway for a moment, holding the breakfast tray, and looked at the empty room with the mild confusion of someone whose morning routine has encountered an unexpected variable. On the windowsill, where the Omega Healer's few personal items had been arranged with the economy of someone accustomed to traveling light, there was nothing. Nothing except a small leather ledger, its cover worn smooth with handling, placed in the center of the sill with the deliberateness of something meant to be found. The servant set down the tray, picked up the ledger, opened it. The first page was a list of names. Court physician Marin received the report 20 minutes later and went directly to the king. Aldric was reviewing border correspondence when she entered. He looked up with the mild, administrative attention of a man for whom an Omega aide's unannounced departure was a minor staffing matter, the kind of thing his court managed a dozen times a month without requiring his direct involvement. Marin set the ledger on his desk without speaking. He looked at her. He looked at the ledger. He opened it. The third name on the first page was Commander Davin Holt, a senior pack commander who had suffered a permanent bond fracture 2 years prior and had been formally documented in the court's own medical records as unrecoverable. Beside his name, in small careful handwriting, fully restored 14 months prior. Aldric looked up. Marin's expression told him everything. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I'd love to know how far this story reaches. The first investigator Aldric sent came back in 3 days with a report that was thorough, precise, and deeply unsettling in the way of documents that contain nothing alarming on their surface and produce alarm anyway, through the accumulation of ordinary details that refuse to add up to anything ordinary. He sent Marin instead. Marin came back in 5 days and sat across from him in his study and delivered her findings in the measured, careful voice of a physician who has learned to manage her own reactions before she manages anyone else's. She had interviewed the families of the 3 most recent names in the ledger. Each interview had produced, with a consistency that Marin described as statistically improbable and emotionally undeniable, the same portrait. The first wolf was a male elder named Gregor, from a mid-territory pack 3 days east of the capital. His bond fracture had occurred 4 years ago, his bonded partner killed in a livestock raid. The damage to his bond structure so severe that 2 separate court physicians had assessed him and filed identical conclusions. Permanent, irrecoverable, managed with palliative resonance support. He had been managing for 4 years when she arrived. He described her arrival with the specific vagueness of someone recalling a dream. She simply appeared. He said, at the pack's edge, in the early morning, traveling alone. She asked to speak with him. She stayed for 11 days. When she left, his bond structure was whole. What he remembered most clearly was not the repair itself. He had drifted in and out of consciousness through much of it, which Marin noted with the focused attention of someone cataloging symptoms, but the quality of her presence during it. She was very quiet, he said. She moved carefully, like someone conserving something. She did not talk about herself. She asked him on the first day to describe his bond damage from the inside, what it felt like, where it felt absent, what he had lost the ability to feel. She listened to his answer with the complete, unrushed attention of someone for whom his description was the most important information available. Nobody had asked him that before. In 4 years of palliative care, no one had asked him what the damage felt like from the inside. She looked older than she should, he added, almost as an afterthought. He had assumed she was perhaps 50, 55. Something about the way she moved, he said. Something about her eyes. The second wolf was younger, a female in her mid-30s named Petra, from a northern settlement pack. Her bond fracture had come from betrayal rather than death. A bonded partner who had severed the connection deliberately. A form of damage the medical literature documented as among the most severe precisely because it combined the structural collapse of the fracture with the psychological wound of the choice behind it. Petra had been assessed as unrecoverable 18 months after the severance. She had been living with that assessment for 2 years when the healer arrived. Petra remembered more clearly than Gregor, her account more detailed and more raw. She described the healer sitting with her every day for 3 weeks, not performing a dramatic intervention, not conducting any procedure that looked from the outside like medicine, simply sitting in sustained proximity. Her hands occasionally resting near, but not quite touching Petra's. She described a gradual process, a slow, almost imperceptible sense of something being rebuilt. The way feeling returns to a numb limb not all at once, but in small, tentative increments that are almost worse than the numbness because they remind you of what you had been missing. By the end of the 3rd week, Petra said she could feel her pack again. Not the severed bond, that was gone. And the healer had been honest with her that it could not be restored. Only the structure that had collapsed around its loss. But the capacity, the ability to feel connection, to receive pack frequency, to exist within the resonance network rather than outside it. She had not felt that in 2 years. She tried to thank the healer properly on the last day. The healer deflected with the practiced ease of someone who had been deflecting gratitude for a long time. Petra Prest. She asked at minimum to know the healer's full name, so she could speak of her accurately. The healer said her name was Thessaly, and that was sufficient, and that Petra did not owe her anything except the use of what had been restored. She looked tired when she left, Petra said, more tired than when she arrived. She had seemed tired when she arrived. The 3rd wolf was a child. She was 8 years old, and her name was Senna, and she answered the investigator's knock herself and looked up at the unfamiliar face with the direct, assessing gaze of a child who has learned to manage uncertainty. She said, "Are you here about the lady who fixed my papa?" Her father, a wolf named Oscar, had suffered his fracture in a border skirmish, partner killed beside him. The traumatic severance occurring in the violence of the moment rather than through the slow grief of loss. He had been unrecoverable for 3 years. Senna had been 5 years old when the damage happened and had no memory of her father being otherwise. Marin conducted the full interview. Oscar described the repair with the quiet, careful language of a man still navigating the enormity of what he had been given back. He said he had tried to pay her. She had refused twice, with the pleasant firmness of someone who had clearly refused this particular offer many times before. He had pressed a 3rd time, and she had said, "The only thing I ask is that you use it well, that you do not waste what has been given back to you." He was crying when he said it, not dramatically, simply steadily. The way people cry when they are describing something that still feels improbable. She looked like she was running out of time, he said, and she had decided not to mention it. Aldric sat with Marin's report in his hands for a long time after she finished speaking. Outside his study window, the capital was conducting its ordinary afternoon business, the sounds of a city going about its life in the specific, indifferent way of large systems that do not register the individual costs of their own functioning. He looked at the ledger. 300 names. 300 wolves whose bond fractures had been assessed as permanent, as irrecoverable, as the end of a particular kind of life. 300 wolves who were whole. He set the report down. He asked Marin, in a voice that was carefully managed and controlled in the specific way of a man managing something that is threatening to become unmanageable, how long ago was the earliest entry in the ledger? 11 years, Marin said. The room was very quiet. Marin had found 2 prior medical assessments of Thessaly in the court's administrative archive. She set them on Aldric's desk the following morning with the expression of a physician who has Reviewed documents that have made her simultaneously impressed and furious, the specific combination of emotions produced by competence that has been catastrophically undervalued. The first assessment was 6 years old. A traveling court physician named Edlow had encountered Thessaly in a Western Pac settlement and filed a standard Omega gift evaluation, the routine documentation required when any Omega with an unusual ability came to the attention of official medical channels. Edlow's report was 3 paragraphs long. It described bond-adjacent healing ability of uncertain mechanism, minor local efficacy, Omega designation, no threat assessment required. The gift classification was listed as Category 3, minor palliative. The recommended action was monitoring. There was no evidence that any monitoring had occurred. The second assessment was 4 years old, filed by a different physician following Thessaly's one documented visit to the capital. It was marginally more detailed. It noted that multiple wolves in the Western Territories reported subjective improvement in bond function following her visits, but it drew no clinical conclusions from this. Attributed the reported improvements to natural recovery and positive expectation, and recommended no further action. Aldric had initialed this report. He sat looking at his own initial for a moment with the expression of a man confronting a small, damning piece of evidence about himself. Marin said, with the careful neutrality of someone choosing her words precisely. Both assessments failed to conduct direct observation of the gift in action. Both relied entirely on testimony. Neither physician requested to be present during a repair. Why not? Aldric said. Because Marin said they did not believe there was anything to observe. The established consensus on permanent bond fracture is that it cannot be repaired. The physicians who assessed her encountered a claim that contradicted established consensus and made the most common error available to a certain kind of medical professional. They trusted the consensus over the evidence. Aldric asked her what direct observation would have shown. Marin opened a second folder. Inside was a handwritten testimony, 14 pages, from a wolf named Corvin, who had submitted it to Marin's investigation with the thoroughness of someone who had been waiting for the opportunity to be formally believed. His bond fracture had occurred 3 years prior to Thessaly's repair, his bonded partner dead of a sudden illness. The fracture developing over the following months, as his bond structure collapsed under the sustained weight of a loss it had not been designed to sustain alone. By the time Thessaly found him, he had been assessed by 3 physicians, all of whom had said the same thing in different words. There is nothing to be done. He had accepted this. He had begun to understand in the specific, quiet way of someone coming to terms with a permanent limitation, what the rest of his life would feel like inside this new constraint. She arrived on a Tuesday in early autumn, he wrote. She knocked. She introduced herself by her given name only. She said she had heard about his situation and wanted to help, if he was willing. He asked what she could do. She said she could try to rebuild the damaged structure. She said she could not promise it would work. She had never encountered a fracture quite this severe, and she wanted him to have accurate expectations. She said it would take time, and that the process would require him to remain as still and as open as he could manage. He asked what it would cost him. She paused before answering. She said, "Nothing. It will cost you nothing." The repair took 2 days and 3 nights. Corvin described it in the careful, searching language of someone trying to render an experience for which ordinary vocabulary was inadequate. He described a sustained sensation of warmth and pressure centered on his chest, not painful, not dramatic, simply persistent, the way sunlight is persistent on skin exposed to it long enough. He described a gradual sense of movement in the structure of his bond, the shattered lattice he had learned to think of as permanently destroyed slowly, incrementally shifting, filament by filament finding new positions, new connections, new integrity. He described falling asleep at intervals and waking to find her still present, still working. Her hands not touching him, but held at a distance of several inches from his sternum, her eyes closed. Her breathing slow and controlled in the way of someone performing sustained physical effort. On the second evening, he woke from a brief sleep to find her sitting with her head bowed. Not in the working posture, but in the posture of someone who has temporarily run out of what they need to continue and is waiting for it to return. He asked if she was all right. She raised her head and looked at him and said yes, she simply needed a few minutes. Her voice was steady. Her face was not quite steady. He saw, in that unguarded moment, that what she was doing was costing her something she had not described when she said it would cost him nothing. He did not know what to do with this information. He did not know what she was giving. He only knew. When he woke on the morning of the third day and felt his bond structure click back into wholeness, felt the resonance network flood through him, felt his pack come back into range, felt the capacity for connection return like a tide, that she had given him something he had been certain was gone forever. He looked for her immediately. She was in the chair beside his bed, asleep with the absolute, total quality of someone whose body has demanded unconsciousness. Her hair at the temples, he wrote, had new gray in it that had not been there when she arrived. He let her sleep for 6 hours. When she woke, he made her eat, pressed food on her with the insistence of someone who understood, even without full understanding, that something needed to be replenished. She accepted the food with the slightly surprised expression of someone unaccustomed to being taken care of. She asked how he felt. He told her. She nodded, with the satisfied attention of someone confirming a successful outcome rather than the emotion of someone who has just performed something extraordinary. She said she was glad. She picked up her bag. She said she needed to move on. There were others waiting. He asked how many. She said enough. He asked what it had cost her. She smiled. It was a genuine smile, he wrote, not a deflection. It simply did not answer the question. She said, "Nothing you need to worry about." She left. He watched her go down the road from his doorway and thought about the new gray in her hair and the way she had been asleep with such totality and the way she had answered his question, and he understood. In the specific way of someone putting together pieces they were not given all at once. That the nothing he did not need to worry about was not nothing at all. Aldric set down Corvin's testimony. He looked at Maren. He asked, how much of herself is she using? Per repair. In physiological terms. Maren was quiet for the specific interval of a woman calculating whether to soften her answer and deciding against it. She is using her own life energy, Maren said, directly and irreversibly. The aging the witnesses describe is not metaphorical. Each repair draws on her biological reserves in a way that accelerates her physical aging, proportionally to the severity of the damage she is repairing. Minor fractures cost weeks. Severe fractures like Corvin's cost months, possibly years. Aldric said nothing. Maren said, she has performed 300 repairs over 11 years. The study was very quiet. Aldric asked, how old is she? Maren said, her palace registration lists her as 31. Her father's name was Emmett. This was the first thing Aldric learned when Maren's investigators reached Thessaly's home pack in the northern settlements, a small, tight-knit community built along a river bend. The kind of place that remembered everything and discussed it quietly and at length among itself, and revealed it to outsiders only with the specific reluctance of people who understood that the stories they carried belonged to the people who had lived them. The pack elder who finally agreed to speak had known Thessaly since her birth. She sat across from Maren's investigator with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral, and told the story in the measured, unsentimental way of someone who had thought about it for a long time and had arrived, through that thinking, at a position of complex understanding rather than simple judgment. Emmett had bonded young, 19, to a woman named Calla who was, by every account, exactly the kind of person that 19-year-old bond decisions occasionally produce. Brilliant and warm, and entirely specific in the way of people who cannot be generalized. They had Thessaly at 21. They had 11 years together that the pack elder described as genuinely good years. Not the retrospectively gilded good years of grief, but the ordinary documented, witnessed good years of two people who suited each other and knew it, and did not take it for granted. Calla died of a fever in the spring of Thessaly's 12th year. It was fast, 4 days from first symptom to the end. The kind of speed that does not allow preparation, and is a specific cruelty all its own. The pack grieved. Emmett survived the immediate loss in the way that bonded wolves sometimes do, in the shock of the first weeks. The bond structure intact because the trauma has not yet fully registered. The body still oriented toward something that is no longer there. The fracture developed over the following months. Thessaly watched it happen. She would describe this later, in the fragments of her own account that Marin's investigators assembled from the people who had known her, as watching someone fade. Not dramatically, not all at once, simply a progressive, incremental dimming, her father present in the room and less present in the room. His responses to the world around him becoming slower, more effortful, as if the signal he was receiving from everything outside himself was weakening. He could still function. He went to work. He fed her. He answered when she spoke to him. But the quality of his attention was changing, and she was 12 years old and understood, with the specific, terrible clarity of a child who has been paying very close attention, that what was happening to him was not ordinary grief. She felt it for the first time on a Sunday morning in late winter. She was sitting beside him at the kitchen table, and she reached for the salt, and her hand passed near his sternum, and she felt it, a distinct, specific impression, visual and tactile simultaneously, that she would spend years trying to find language for, and eventually describe as seeing broken light. A shattered lattice where a whole structure should have been. Specific, precise, unmistakably real. She sat with her hands suspended over the table and stared at her father's chest and felt, in the particular way of a child encountering something that does not fit any available category, both frightened and absolutely certain. She did not know what she was seeing. She did not know what to do with what she was seeing. She only knew, with the wordless conviction of someone operating on an instinct so deep it predates language, that it was something she could reach. She began that same Sunday. She did not tell her father what she was doing. She was not certain she could explain it, and she was afraid that explaining it would require an accuracy she did not yet have. She simply began sitting with him, every evening, in sustained proximity. Her attention directed inward toward the impression of broken light she could feel when she was close enough. She tried, in the way of someone trying to perform a skill they have never been taught and have no manual for, to do something with what she was feeling. To reach it, to touch it. It took 4 weeks before she felt the first filament move. It was a small thing, a single thread of the shattered lattice shifting, finding a new position, connecting to another broken end with a quality that she would later describe as a click, felt rather than heard. She went to bed that night more exhausted than she had ever been, with the specific exhaustion of sustained effort rather than physical activity. And she woke the next morning with new understanding. She could do this. It would take time. It was working. It took 11 weeks in total. 11 weeks of daily sustained contact, of sitting beside her father at the kitchen table or on the porch or in the front room in the evenings, her attention directed toward his chest, her hands folded in her lap so that no one watching would see anything unusual. The cost accumulated in ways she did not fully understand until later. She was tired more often than she should have been. She caught a cold that took 3 weeks to resolve. She noticed in the small mirror above the wash basin that her face looked different, though she could not have said precisely how. On the 68th day, her father looked up from his dinner and said something that he had not said in almost a year. He asked her, with the full present attention of someone who was genuinely there, how her day had been. She told him. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and told him about her day in complete sentences. and he listened with the focused, real attention of a father who was present for his child. And she felt the resonance of his bond structure, whole or nearly whole, its connections still tender but functional, radiating outward from him in the way of something that had been restored. She was 12 years old. She was exhausted in her bones. She felt, underneath the exhaustion, a satisfaction so complete and specific that she would spend years looking for an adequate comparison and not finding one. Her father never fully understood what she had done. She did not explain it. She was afraid, with the reasonable fear of a child who had watched how her community responded to things it did not understand, of what explanation would produce. She filed the experience away in the category of things that were true and could not be discussed. And she moved through the following years as ordinary children move through them: school, work, the gradual accumulation of the skills and experiences that constitute a life. She left the pack at 16. The official reason was opportunity, a healer's apprenticeship in the nearest large settlement. Legitimate and appropriate, and entirely true as far as it went. The actual reason was that she had, by the age of 16, quietly repaired the bond fractures of 3 additional wolves in her home pack. All of them without announcement, and without anyone connecting the repairs to her presence, and she had understood that the small, watchful community of her home pack was approaching the point at which the coincidences would begin to add up. She had also understood, by 16, that there were more broken bonds in the world than her home pack contained, and that she could reach them, and that this fact had the specific quality of a thing that was going to determine how she spent her life regardless of what else she chose. She apprenticed genuinely. She learned conventional healing alongside the unconventional thing she already knew. She moved from settlement to settlement, from pack to pack, building the quiet, methodical practice of a woman who understood exactly what she was doing and had decided that the understanding was sufficient, that she did not need official sanction, did not need institutional recognition, did not need anyone's permission to do what needed to be done. She had been doing it for 11 years when she disappeared. Aldric closed the investigator's report. He sat for a long moment with the pages in his hands, and the weight of what they contained settled across him with the specific, undeniable heaviness of something he was not going to be able to set aside. He thought about the 12-year-old girl at the kitchen table. He thought about 11 weeks of silent effort and 68 days, and the moment her father asked how her day had been. He thought about 16 years old, and a decision made with the clear-eyed certainty of someone who already understood the cost and had decided, without drama and without hesitation, that it was worth it. He thought about 300 names in a worn leather ledger. He looked at Marin. She was watching him with the patient, careful attention of a woman who had been waiting for this particular moment in this particular man's understanding and had known it would arrive. "She is not merely missing," he said. It was not quite a question. "No," Marin said. "Her body has been sustaining this level of output for 11 years. The physiological mathematics are—" She paused. She said, "She went to the sanctuary because she knew she was nearly finished." The room was very still. He said, "Is she still alive?" Marin said, "The resonance signatures in the wolves she healed are still faintly active. If she had died, the signatures would have changed. She is alive, but she will not be for very much longer if she completes the final repair without intervention." Aldric stood. He was already moving toward the door when he said, "How long do we have?" Marin said, "Weeks. Perhaps less." He said, "Ready the horses." Aldric did not send investigators this time. He told his senior court advisor, a careful man named Brennan, who had spent 20 years learning to read the king's decisions before they were announced, that he would be conducting a personal inspection of Northern Pact territories. Brennan received this information with the practiced neutrality of someone who knew when a stated reason and the actual reason occupied different rooms entirely, and said nothing beyond the logistics. Aldric rode out the following morning with Marin, 2 guards, and a copy of the ledger in his saddlebag. His first stop was Corvin. He had read Corvin's 14-page testimony twice. He had told himself, riding the first 2 days north, that he was stopping there for completeness, that written testimony was adequate for administrative purposes, but that direct conversation occasionally produced details that documents missed. This was true. It was also not the whole reason, and he knew it and did not examine it closely. Welcome back to the Alpha King Rain channel. Today I'm bringing you a brand new and incredibly captivating story that will surely enthrall you if you listen to the whole video. The story is entirely fictional. The video is created using AI, and it's designed to provide value, entertainment, and positive education for viewers aged 13 and up. Now let's dive into today's story. Corvin lived on the eastern edge of a mid-territory pack settlement, a large, scarred man who opened his door and looked at the king with the specific expression of someone deciding, in real time, whether a person of significant authority deserved his honesty. The decision took approximately 4 seconds. He stepped back and let them in. He told Aldric things that had not been in the written report. The quality of her attention, he said, not the content of it, but the quality. The way she was entirely present in the room in a way that most people were not, as if she had no competing concerns. As if the only thing that existed during those 2 days was him and his damage and the work of repairing it. He said he had been assessed by 3 physicians before her, all of them competent. All of them genuinely sorry about what they were unable to offer him. And none of them had ever made him feel the way she made him feel, which was simply seen. Aldric asked what she had said about herself. Corvin shook his head. Almost nothing. He had tried to draw her out on the 2nd day, asked where she was from, how long she had been doing this work, whether she had family somewhere. She deflected each question with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for a long time. Not rudely, simply with the firm, pleasant certainty of someone who had decided that her personal history was not relevant to the work at hand. He had asked her why she was doing it, directly at the end, when his bond structure had been restored, and he was still sitting with the overwhelming quality of what that felt like. He asked, "Why do you do this?" She said, "Because you needed it done and I could do it." As if, Corvin said, looking at Aldric with the calm directness of a man delivering something important, that were the only math that mattered. As if need plus capability equaled obligation, automatically without remainder. Aldric rode away from Corvin's settlement with something sitting in his chest that he identified. With the honest precision he applied to things that were difficult to name, as shame. Not the abstract shame of institutional failure. Something more personal. The specific shame of a man who had held a piece of paper with this woman's name on it and initialed it and moved to the next item, and in doing so had made a choice. Not dramatically, not with awareness of its significance, but a choice nonetheless, to treat something extraordinary as something routine. The next name on the list lived 4 days north. They rode. The territory changed around them, the managed agricultural landscape of the capital's surroundings giving way to the wider, rougher country of the mid-territories, the settlements more dispersed, the roads less maintained, the sky larger. Aldric had not ridden this far from the capital in 2 years. He had forgotten, in the way of people whose lives have become organized around a fixed point, what the rest of the kingdom looked like at ground level. They arrived at the 4th-day settlement in the early evening. The house was small and well kept. Marin knocked. A sound from inside, light footsteps. Quick and uneven in the way of a child who has not yet learned to regulate her own urgency. The door opened. The child was perhaps 8 years old. She had her father's dark eyes and a directness of gaze that children sometimes have when they have grown up in households where honesty is practiced and modeled. She looked up at Aldric without particular awe. He was not in formal dress. And kings do not announce themselves in the way their representations suggest, and said, with the clear, practical interest of someone asking a genuinely relevant question. "Are you here about the lady who fixed my papa?" Aldric looked at her for a moment. He said, "Yes." She opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "Papa will want to talk to you. He talks about her sometimes. He thinks she doesn't want to be thanked, but he wants to anyway." Aldric stepped inside. He glanced back at Marin, who was watching him with the careful, assessing expression she had been wearing for several days. The expression of a woman monitoring a patient whose symptoms are developing in a direction she had predicted and finds simultaneously vindicating and concerning. He turned back to the child. "What is your name?" he said. "Senna," she said. "She fixed Papa when I was 5. I don't remember before. But Papa says before was very different." They rode for 8 more days. Aldric had planned for 5. The plan extended itself naturally. The way plans do when the thing being investigated keeps producing more than the investigation anticipated, when each stop generates new names, new details, new dimensions of a portrait that refuses to resolve into something simple enough to file and close. He stopped counting the testimonies after the 12th. He started counting them again at 20. Because Marin told him the accumulated medical data was producing patterns he needed to understand quantitatively as well as qualitatively, and the numbers required a baseline. The testimonies were not identical. The wolves Thessaly had healed were different people in different circumstances with different relationships to what had happened to them and different ways of describing it. But they produced, in their aggregate, the same woman, the same portrait assembled from different angles. The way a face becomes fully dimensional only when seen from multiple directions simultaneously. A female elder in a highland pack described Thessaly arriving in deep winter, half frozen from the mountain road, refusing to rest or eat or warm herself before asking to be taken directly to the wolf who needed her. The elder had pressed. Thessaly had said, with the pleasant firmness that everyone described and that Aldric was beginning to hear as a kind of signature, "I will rest when I've seen him." The elder had taken her. She had assessed the damage with a brief, focused attention, her hands held at a distance from the wolf's chest, her eyes closed. Her expression the expression of someone reading something in a language only she knew. And then she had sat down in the chair beside him and said, "This will take some time," and had begun. She sang in the highlands. A young male wolf named Bryn said she sang quietly while she worked, very softly. So softly that he had first thought he was imagining it. He could not make out words. It was not a recognizable song. It was the specific, unself-conscious sound of someone who was not performing, but simply producing sound the way people produce sound when they are deep in concentration, and the part of them that monitors for observation has gone offline. He had lain still and listened to her sing for 2 days and nights, and had understood, in some wordless way, that the singing and the healing were related, that the sound was part of how she worked, part of how she sustained the effort, a rhythm she had developed through years of solitary practice. A pack leader named Wren described trying to pay her. He had prepared a formal compensation, a significant sum, appropriate for the restoration of something the medical establishment had declared permanently lost. She had declined it twice with the practiced ease of someone who had been declining payment for a long time. He had pressed a 3rd time, framing it as the pack's formal acknowledgement rather than personal payment. She had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, with the directness that appeared in every testimony without variation, "The only thing I ask is that the healed wolves use their restored bonds well, that they not waste what has been given back to them." Wren had asked what she meant by waste. She had considered the question seriously, which he noted. She took his questions seriously, even the ones that seemed simple. She said, "A restored bond is a second chance at connection. I ask that it be used for connection, that the wolf who receives it does not close themselves off from what it makes possible, out of fear of losing it again." She said it matter-of-factly, without sentimentality, as if she had thought about it for a long time and had arrived at this formulation and considered it adequate. He had tried after that to ask about her, where she went between repairs, who took care of her the way she took care of others. She had smiled. Everyone described the smile, the specific quality of it, genuine and slightly deflecting simultaneously, and said she managed. On the third evening of the extended ride, Maren presented her calculations to Aldric at the camp's edge, away from the guards, in the quiet of a fire burning low. She had been building the model for days, cross-referencing the testimony accounts of Thessaly, aging with the documented severity of each repair in the ledger. The model was conservative, she said. She had used the lowest plausible estimates at every point where the data allowed interpretation. The total cost of 300 repairs over 11 years, she said, conservatively estimated, was between 60 and 80 years of accelerated biological aging. Aldric looked at the numbers for a long time. He asked, "How old does she appear?" Maren said, "The witness descriptions are consistent. She appears to be approximately 60, possibly older." "She is 31, Aldric said. It was not quite a question. He already knew the answer. "Yes," Maren said. The fire burned between them. An owl moved through the dark above the camp with a sound like a held breath. Aldric sat with the numbers and thought about the 12-year-old girl at the kitchen table and the decision made at 16 and the 11 years of roads and pack settlements and the weight of 300 repairs carried in a body that was 31 years old and had the evidence of 60 written into it. He thought about the one time she had come to the capital, the report that had crossed his desk, the single line, the initial he had written without looking up. He had been in the same building as her. He had approved a payment and moved on. He said nothing to Maren. There was nothing to say that the numbers had not already said with more precision than he could manage. They broke camp at dawn. The next settlement was a half-day's ride. The wolf who answered the door was a man named Aldous with his daughter on his hip, the child looking at Aldric with the calm, assessing directness of someone who had inherited her father's particular quality of attention. Aldous spoke for a long time. He described the repair with the reverence of someone describing something they consider sacred, not religiously sacred, but sacred in the specific sense of something that should not be minimized or made ordinary by careless language. At the end, unprompted, he said, "She told me she was going somewhere when she was done. She said she had one repair left, in the far northern pack, and then she was going to rest. She said it like resting was something she hadn't done in a while. She said," he paused, "the way people pause when they are trying to reproduce something accurately because the accuracy matters. She said she was looking forward to being still." Aldric stood in Aldous' doorway and looked at the northern horizon where the mountains were a gray suggestion above the tree-line. Being still. He turned the phrase over in his mind and understood it, clearly and completely, for exactly what it was. He turned to Maren. She was already looking at him. She said, "The resonance signature is coming from the northern range. There is a documented sanctuary in the Ashfall Mountains. Ancient, rarely used." "How far?" he said. "For days," she said, "if we ride hard." Maren explained it on the second morning of the northern ride, when the territory around them had shifted fully into mountain country, and the air had taken on the specific quality of high altitude, thinner, clearer, carrying sound differently. She had been running the analysis for 2 days. She presented it the way she presented all significant findings, without preamble, without softening, with the direct precision of a woman who believed that accurate information delivered clearly was a form of respect. The 300 restored bond structures, she said, all bore Thessaly's energy signature. This was expected. Every healer left a trace in the work they performed, a kind of biological fingerprint in the repaired tissue. What was not expected, what Maren had not encountered in any documented medical literature, was the behavior of those signatures in aggregate. 300 bond structures bearing the same origin signature, distributed across the kingdom, were creating a resonance network, a web of connections sharing a common source, oriented toward that source the way iron filings orient toward a magnet. The network was faint, barely detectable with standard resonance assessment tools, but it was real, and it was directional, and the direction it pointed was north. Thessaly was alive. The signature was present, but it was weakening in the specific way Marin associated with severe depletion rather than ordinary fatigue, a progressive dimming rather than the fluctuation of a healthy system at rest. Aldric asked how long. Marin said she did not know precisely. She said weeks if she stops, less if she completes the repair. He asked if she would stop. Marin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, based on everything we know about her, no. They rode harder after that. In the evenings, when the camp was settled and the fire was low and Marin was recording her daily resonance readings with the methodical attention of someone monitoring something fragile, Aldric sat with the ledger and read it in a way he had not read it before, not as a list of names, as a record of decisions, each entry representing a moment when Thessaly had arrived somewhere and assessed the damage and made the choice to begin. 300 individual choices, each one made with the full knowledge of what it would cost her, each one made in silence, without witnesses, without record beyond the private ledger she had kept and left on a windowsill when she finally left. He had been trying, since Corvin's settlement, to understand the shape of her inner life, to construct, from the testimony fragments, some sense of what it had been like to be her, to carry that gift and that knowledge, and that cost through 11 years of roads and packed settlements and repairs performed in other people's homes and departures made before the gratitude could fully arrive. He could not quite reach it. The picture assembled from testimony was detailed and vivid and felt, somehow, like a photograph of someone in motion, capturing the outline accurately, but missing the specific, interior quality of what it felt like to be in that particular body, making those particular choices. He needed to hear it from her. This understanding arrived with a clarity that surprised him, given how recently he had not known she existed. Now Thessaly's own account arrived, assembled by Marin's investigators from the fragments of her history that others had preserved. Her voice, reconstructed from the things she had said to the wolves she healed, was consistent across every testimony, practical, precise, without self-pity, occasionally and briefly wry in a way that suggested she found the world genuinely interesting when she had enough energy to notice it. One testimony, from a wolf named Sarah in a western settlement, contained something different. Sarah had pressed harder than most on the personal questions, with the persistence of a woman who had decided that Thessaly deserved to be known by someone even if she resisted it. Thessaly had eventually said, after the third or fourth deflection, something that Sarah had written down immediately and preserved. I am not doing this because I am good. I am doing it because I cannot not do it. There is a difference. The first would make me a saint. The second just makes me someone who understands what their hands are for. Aldric read this 3 times. On the 3rd day of the northern ride, Marin pulled her horse alongside his at midday and said, without introduction, the signature has intensified. He looked at her. Good or bad, he said. She said, it can mean 2 things. She is closer than I calculated, or she is in distress. Given the northern direction and our current position, I believe it is likely both. He pressed the pace. On the 4th morning, the mountains were no longer a suggestion. They rose ahead in the specific, absolute way of mountains that have been there for a very long time and have acquired a settled authority about it. The road narrowed and steepened. The trees thinned. The air was cold with the clean, indifferent cold of altitude. Marin checked her readings at the mountain's base and pointed to a path that wound upward along the eastern face. The signature, she said, was concentrated, stable but dim. She is there. She is still. He looked at the guards. He looked at Marin. He said, wait here. Marin opened her mouth. He said, "I will call if I need you." She closed it, with the expression of a physician overriding her professional instincts in deference to a decision she disagreed with and understood simultaneously. He went up alone. The path was narrow and the footing was careful work, and the altitude made itself known in the specific way of high places, a slight pressure at the temples, a quality of effort in ordinary breathing. He climbed for an hour. The sanctuary appeared around a bend in the path without announcement, a small stone building, low and old, sitting at the mountain's edge with the settled permanence of something that had been there long enough to stop announcing itself. He stopped outside it. He stood for a moment in the thin mountain air and understood that whatever happened next would be determined by what he was when he walked through the door. Not what he held, not what he commanded, not what authority the crown afforded him. What he actually was underneath all of it as a person, whether that was sufficient. He opened the door. Before he had climbed the mountain, he had made one final stop. The testimony he had been saving, not deliberately, not with full awareness of why he was leaving it until last, was Finn's. The youngest name in the recent section of the ledger. 19 years old. The most recent repair before Thessaly had gone north. Finn lived in a small settlement at the mountain range's southern edge, a half-day's detour from the direct path to the sanctuary. Aldric had taken the detour without explaining it to Marin, who had noted it on her map and said nothing. Finn answered the door himself. He was exactly as young as his age suggested, broad-shouldered, still carrying the unfinished quality of someone who had not yet fully grown into himself, with the specific, careful eyes of someone who had experienced something that had permanently revised his understanding of what was possible. He looked at Aldric and said, "You are here about Thessaly." Not a question, a recognition. Aldric said yes. Finn let him in. His bond fracture had come early, at 17, when his bonded partner, a childhood friend he had bonded with in the instinctive, unplanned way of very young wolves, had died in a sudden accident. The fracture had developed within months. He had been assessed at 18 as permanently unrecoverable, a diagnosis delivered to a boy of 18 with the careful, apologetic professionalism of a physician who understood he was describing a life significantly narrowed before it had properly begun. Thessaly had arrived 4 months later. Finn described her arrival the way several others had, quiet, unannounced, traveling alone. What he described differently was the conversation before the repair began. She had sat across from him at his kitchen table and explained, in terms he could actually understand, what she was going to try to do. Not in technical language, in plain, honest language. The kind that treats the listener as someone entitled to full information. She had said, "Your bond structure collapsed when you lost her. What I am going to try to do is rebuild the structure itself, not the bond. That cannot be restored, but the architecture around it. The capacity, so that you can connect again when you are ready if you choose to." He had asked why she was offering this to him specifically. She said she had heard about his situation from a wolf in the next settlement. He asked who had told her. She named someone. He said, "That person did not know about my fracture. It was not discussed outside the family." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I apologize. I should have been more careful about how I found you. I did not want you to feel surveilled." He said, "How did you find me?" She said, with the honest simplicity of someone who had decided the truth was easier, "I can feel bond damage from a distance. Yours has been visible to me since I arrived in this region. I am sorry I could not come sooner." He had not known what to say to that. He had said, "How far away can you feel it?" She had considered the question with genuine interest. The way she considered all questions that were actually about her gift rather than about him. She said, "It depends on the severity. Yours is significant. I felt it from about 2 miles. He sat with that for a moment. He said, "You travel toward the damage." She said, "Yes." He said, "Always." She said, "It is difficult to move away from it once I have felt it. It is, she paused. It is like hearing someone call for help and deciding not to answer. I find I cannot consistently make that decision. The repair took 4 days. Finn described it with a precision that came from youth and from the specific quality of attention he had brought to it. He had paid close attention because he had understood, from the first conversation, that what she was doing was significant, and he had wanted to understand it fully. He described the daily progression of the reconstruction, the gradual return of sensation in his bond structure, the incremental rebuilding. He described watching her face over those 4 days and seeing it change. She had arrived tired, he said. Not ill, she moved easily, her mind was sharp, her conversation was engaged. But tired in the specific, deep way that goes below the surface. The way that rest addresses, but does not fully resolve. By the second day the tiredness was more visible. By the third day she was working in the mornings and sleeping in the afternoons, which she had not done on the first 2 days, and the sleep had the total, absolute quality that Corvin had also described, the unconsciousness of a body demanding what it needs rather than requesting it. On the 4th morning she completed it. He felt it, the final connection establishing itself, his bond structure clicking into wholeness. The resonance network flooding back with a completeness that overwhelmed him for several minutes. He could feel his pack. He could feel the network he had been outside of for 2 years. He sat in his chair and felt it and could not speak. When he could speak, he looked at her. She was in the chair across from him, her hands in her lap, her eyes open and attentive. She looked, he said, 10 years older than she had on the first day. He had noticed the change each day, the progressive silvering of her hair at the temples, the deepening of the lines at the corners of her eyes. He had not said anything because he had not known how. Now he said, "What does it cost you?" She smiled. It was the genuine smile that everyone described. She said, "Nothing you need to worry about." He pressed. He said, "I am worried about it regardless. Please tell me." She looked at him for a moment. She seemed to be deciding something, assessing him. With the specific attention she gave to things she was trying to understand accurately. Then she said, "It costs time. My time, not yours. Mine to spend as I choose." He said, "You are choosing to spend it on this." She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She said, in the same quiet, certain voice with which she said everything that mattered, "Because someone has to. And I can. And I have not yet found a sufficient reason to stop." He had asked one more thing. He had asked if she was all right. Whether, beneath the practiced deflection and the genuine care for others and the 11 years of roads, she was all right. She had been quiet for a long time. Long enough that he had thought she was not going to answer. Then she said, "I am going somewhere to rest when I leave here. Somewhere still. I think I need still for a while." He had said, "I hope you find it." She had picked up her bag. She had said, "Thank you for letting me help you." She had said it as if he had done her a favor. Aldric sat in Finn's small kitchen and looked at his hands and felt the specific weight of everything Finn had told him settle across him completely. He asked, "Did she say where she was going?" Finn said, "The Ashfall Sanctuary, in the northern mountains. She said she had heard it was quiet there." Aldric stood. He thanked Finn. He moved to the door. Finn said to his back, "Is she all right?" Aldric stopped. He said, "I am going to find out." Finn said, "Tell her," he paused. "Tell her that I use it well. She asked us to use it well. Tell her I am." Aldric said, "I will." The camp was quiet at the second bell of the night. Marin was asleep. The guards were on rotation. The mountain range rose ahead of them in the dark, a massive, settled presence against the sky. Its outline visible even at this hour because the stars were clear and numerous, and the altitude had sharpened the air into the kind of transparency that makes distances feel simultaneously larger and more precise. Aldric was not sleeping. He sat at the camp's edge with the ledger open across his knees, and a small lamp burning beside him, and he did what he had been doing, in various forms, for the entire length of this ride. He looked at the evidence and tried to make himself fully understand it, rather than stopping at the point where understanding became uncomfortable. He had spent his adult life becoming skilled at a particular kind of thinking, strategic, structural, oriented toward systems and their optimization, toward the identification of failure points and the design of corrections. It was the thinking his role demanded. It had served him and his kingdom well, in the documented, accessible way of things that produce visible results. It had also, he was understanding, produced a specific and significant blind spot. Systems thinking, at its worst, was thinking that stopped at the level of the system and never descended to the level of the individual human being operating within it. It was thinking that could read 300 names on a list and respond with a welfare protocol, rather than with the question of what 300 individual lives had actually looked like from the inside. He had been a systems thinker about Thessaly. He had read a report that described her as bond-adjacent healing ability, Category 3 minor palliative, and he had responded at the system level, filed, initialed, moved on, without descending to the level of the actual person the report was describing, without asking what Category 3 actually meant in the life of the woman it was classifying, without considering that the categories themselves might be catastrophically inadequate to what they were attempting to measure. He had not thought to ask because he had never been required to think at that level about Omega healers. They existed, in his administrative understanding, as a category of service provider, present, useful, to be compensated appropriately according to their registered classification and managed within the existing welfare framework. The framework had seemed adequate because he had never examined it from the perspective of someone for whom it was not. He thought about what she would have needed, not dramatic intervention, simply infrastructure. A registry that required her to document her gift accurately, with someone competent enough to understand what they were reading. A welfare assessment that monitored the cost of her work, conducted with the frequency and the seriousness that the cost warranted. A compensation structure that at minimum provided for her material needs while she spent her life energy, literally, irreversibly, in measured and documented quantities, on the kingdom's most broken wolves. None of it had existed. All of it should have. He had had the power to create it for years, and had never thought to because he had never been required to look at the cost column of his kingdom's invisible labor. He was looking at it now. 300 entries. 11 years. 60 to 80 years of a 31-year-old woman's biological life, given away in settlements and pack houses and small rooms in other people's homes, without record, without witness, without acknowledgement from any institution that should have been watching. He thought about the 12-year-old girl at the kitchen table, working for 11 weeks in silence to bring her father back. He thought about the decision at 16, the clear-eyed, fully informed, completely voluntary decision of someone who understood exactly what they were choosing and chose it anyway, without requiring the choice to be validated by anyone else. He thought about Finn's account, because someone has to, and I can, and I have not yet found a sufficient reason to stop. He had been a sufficient reason. The kingdom had been a sufficient reason. The existence of 300 wolves with shattered bond structures, distributed across a territory he was responsible for governing, had been a sufficient reason, and he had not known to be one, because the system that should have shown it to him had failed to look. He set the ledger down. He took out paper and ink from his saddlebag. He wrote by lamplight in the clear, precise hand he used for formal correspondence when he wanted there to be no ambiguity about what was being said. He wrote to the court counsel. He wrote for a long time. He named the failure, not abstractly, not as a systemic issue requiring administrative correction, but as a specific failure with a specific cause and a specific human cost. He named what Thessaly had done and what it had cost her, and what the kingdom's administrative record showed it had provided in return. He named what needed to change and why. He sealed the letter. He would send it when they reached a settlement large enough to have a courier. He sat for a while longer in the quiet of the mountain dark, looking at the sealed letter in his hands, understanding that what he had written was the beginning of a reckoning that would be uncomfortable for several powerful people and necessary regardless. He looked north. The resonance signature Marin tracked was coming from somewhere in those mountains, faint, present, dimming. He was 2 days away. He was not certain 2 days was soon enough. He put the letter in his saddlebag. He looked at the mountains for another moment. Then he looked down at the lamp and said, quietly, to no one in particular, or perhaps to the woman somewhere in those mountains whose name he had learned too late and was riding toward regardless, I am coming. I know that does not resolve anything. I am coming anyway. The mountains offered nothing in return. He had not expected them to. He folded his coat around himself and sat in the dark and waited for dawn with the specific patience of a man who has understood something too late and has decided that too late is not the same as never. He left Marin at the mountain's base. She objected, professionally, briefly, with the specific efficiency of a physician who understands that her objection will not change the outcome, but considers it her obligation to register it clearly. He acknowledged it. He told her he would call down if he needed her. She told him the resonance signature was stable but dim, which meant Thessaly was present and depleted and not in acute crisis, which meant he had a window and should use it carefully. He said he would. She looked at him for a moment with the assessing directness she had been directing at him for 12 days. She did not say what she was thinking. She stepped back. He went up alone. The path wound along the mountain's eastern face in the careful, deliberate way of paths made by people who understood the terrain and respected it. The footing required attention. He gave it attention, which left less attention available for the things he had been thinking about for 12 days, which was, he suspected not accidentally, exactly the right condition in which to approach this particular door. The sanctuary appeared around a bend without announcement. It was smaller than he had imagined, a single-story stone structure, low and old, sitting at the mountain's edge where the rock flattened into a narrow shelf of land. The stone was darkened with age. The door was plain wood, worn smooth. A small window faced south, admitting the afternoon light. He stood outside for a moment. He had been constructing, for 12 days, versions of how this conversation might begin. He had rejected most of them. The ones that began with formal acknowledgement of the Crown's obligation felt wrong, too institutional, too managed. The language of a king conducting official business, rather than a man who had ridden 12 days to find a specific person for reasons that had become, somewhere along the road, considerably more personal than administrative. The ones that began with apology felt inadequate, not wrong, simply not equal to the scale of what needed to be said. He had arrived at the mountain's base without a plan. He had climbed anyway. He opened the door. The sanctuary's interior was one large room, stone floor, stone walls. The smell of old wood and cold mountain air, and something herbal that lingered from some prior use. A table near the south window. A narrow cot against the far wall. A small fireplace with a low fire burning in it, generating more warmth than its size suggested. She was at the table. She was seated with a cup of something warm between her hands, facing the window and the afternoon light coming through it. And she looked up when the door opened with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who has been expecting something and is ready for it. He saw her clearly. She was 31 years old. She looked, in the honest, unsparing light of the mountain afternoon, closer to 60. Her hair was fully silver, not the silver of age that comes gradually through decades, but the silver of depletion. Bright and complete in a way that spoke of a rapid process rather than a slow one. Her face carried the lines of someone who had spent a very long time in weather and effort and the specific, sustained concentration of work that requires everything. Her hands around the cup were thin. Her eyes were entirely alert, intelligent and calm, and carrying the specific quality of attention he had been hearing described for 12 days, and was now encountering directly. The attention of someone who was fully present, who was not performing presence but simply practicing it, who had no competing concerns at this particular moment, because she had long since learned to be in one place at a time. She looked at him without surprise, without the particular, reflexive deference that his rank typically produced in people who encountered it unexpectedly. She looked at him as one person looks at another, with interest, with the careful assessment of someone trying to understand what they are seeing, with something that was not quite recognition but was adjacent to it. He crossed to the table. He sat in the chair across from her. She watched him sit with the patience of someone who has all the time that is available and has decided to use it without hurrying. The silence between them was not awkward. It had the quality of a silence between two people who have a great deal to say and are both taking a moment to determine the right starting point, which is a different kind of silence than the kind that comes from having nothing. She spoke first. Her voice was quieter than he had constructed from the testimony fragments, lower, slightly rough at the edges in the way of someone who has been alone for a while and has not been using their voice much. She said, "You found the ledger." He said, "Yes." She nodded. A small, satisfied nod, the nod of someone confirming that a thing they intended to happen has happened. He said, "I have been writing for 12 days. She said nothing. She waited. He said, "I have spoken with 47 wolves." She was still. Something moved briefly in her expression at the number. Not surprise exactly, more like a careful, private response to something that mattered, quickly managed back to stillness. He said, "I need you to," and stopped. He stopped because he had reached the place he had been reaching toward for 12 days and discovered that the version of this sentence he needed was not any of the versions he had prepared. He sat in the sanctuary with the afternoon light coming through the south window and the low fire and the herbal smell of old use. And he looked at her and she looked at him, and he said finally the only true thing. "I need you to know that I understand what you did, that I have spent 12 days learning it, that I am not going to manage it into something smaller than it is." She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were still around the cup. The fire made its small, ordinary sounds. She said, "Why did you come yourself?" He said, "Because sending someone else would have been the wrong answer. I have been sending someone else for 11 years without knowing it." She was quiet. She looked at the window. Then she looked back at him with the direct, complete attention that was simply how she saw things. And she said, "You have a great deal to answer for." "Yes," he said. He said it without deflection, without qualification, without the instinctive self-protection of a powerful person encountering criticism. He said it as a simple, accurate statement of fact. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "All right." 2 words, entirely insufficient to contain what they were opening. Both of them understood this. Neither of them looked away. The capital had received Aldric's letter on a Thursday. By Friday morning, Lord Cashenvern had convened an emergency session of the Senior Court Council in the smaller deliberation chamber. Not the great hall, not the formal assembly space, but the working room where difficult things were managed before they became public, which was where Vern preferred to manage most things. He had read the king's letter 3 times. He was a precise man, and precision required full comprehension before response. And full comprehension of this particular document required 3 readings, because the first produced alarm. The second produced the specific variety of alarm that comes from understanding the legal implications, and the third produced a strategy. He presented the strategy to the assembled council with the fluency of someone who had been constructing it since Friday's early hours. His argument was architectural, built on 3 supporting pillars, each one lending stability to the others. The whole structure designed to be technically accurate, while directing attention away from the conclusions that technical accuracy might otherwise produce. Pillar 1. Thessaly's work, however significant, had been performed voluntarily, without contract, without formal engagement with the Crown or any Crown-affiliated institution. Voluntary service carried no legal obligation of compensation beyond what had been offered and accepted. In her case, a modest payment approved 2 years prior, which she had accepted, which constituted the full extent of the Crown's formal relationship with her. Pillar 2. The ledger she had left was a personal document, private records maintained by a private individual, carrying no legal standing as a service record, and therefore generating no legal basis for retroactive compensation claims. Pillar 3. The appropriate response to a situation of this nature was a goodwill gesture, a formal royal acknowledgement of her contribution, accompanied by an ex gratia payment at a rate reflecting the Crown's appreciation without constituting a legal admission of obligation. Generous. Final. Documented as voluntary rather than required. He delivered all 3 pillars with the measured confidence of a man who understood that the most effective arguments were the ones that sounded reasonable rather than the ones that were. The chamber received his argument in the specific silence of people processing something that is being offered as a solution and is being recognized, by some portion of the room, as something else. A younger council member spoke before Vern had finished settling back into his chair. Her name was Alara. She was 34, recently appointed, and she had been watching Vern's presentation with the specific expression of someone who has been waiting for a moment and has identified it accurately. She said, "I want to make sure I understand the argument correctly. We are describing a woman who traveled this kingdom for 11 years, repaired 300 bond fractures assessed as permanently irrecoverable, sustained 60 to 80 years of accelerated biological aging as the direct cost of that work, and operated without compensation, without protection, without registration, without any mechanism by which the Crown could have monitored her welfare or acknowledged her service, and the proposed response is to classify her contribution as voluntary and offer a goodwill payment." Vern said, "That is a somewhat tendentious characterization of." Alara said, "Is it factually inaccurate?" Vern was quiet for a moment. He said, "The voluntary nature of the service is legally established." Alara said, "We are not currently in a legal proceeding. We are in a council session being asked to recommend a response to a situation that our king has described, in his own letter, as a failure of institutional duty. I am asking whether the proposed response addresses the failure or conceals it." The room was very still. Vern said, "The proposed response addresses the situation in a manner that protects the kingdom's legal and financial interests while..." Alara said, "While ensuring that no precedent is set that might require us to look more carefully at how many other Thessalys are currently operating in this kingdom without protection, compensation, or acknowledgement. That is what the 3rd pillar protects, Lord Vern. Not the Crown's legal interests. The Council's convenience." Several council members shifted in their chairs. The specific, uncomfortable shift of people who have recognized an accurate statement that they would prefer not to have made. Vern began a response. He was 3 sentences into it when the door opened and a courier entered with the expression of someone carrying a message that could not wait for a more appropriate moment. The courier crossed to the council secretary and delivered a sealed document. The secretary looked at the seal. He looked at Vern. He said, "It is from the king. A second letter." Vern held out his hand. The secretary hesitated for a fraction of a second, the hesitation of someone who has noted that the first letter addressed the council collectively, and is observing that the second letter is addressed specifically to the secretary for formal entry into the record rather than to Vern for management, and passed it accordingly. The secretary broke the seal. He read the letter's contents aloud in the measured, formal voice of official record. The letter was brief. It said, "I am writing from the northern road. I will be in the capital within the week. I will address the full assembly personally upon my return. Until that time, no formal response to the situation described in my prior letter is to be issued. No legal characterization of Thessaly's service is to be recorded, and no communication is to be sent to any party on this matter without my direct authorization. The authority of this instruction supersedes any prior council deliberation." It was signed with the king's full formal seal, not the administrative seal used for routine correspondence, but the sovereign seal, which carried the specific legal weight of a direct royal command. The chamber was quiet. Vern set his strategy documents face down on the table in the careful, unhurried way of a man who has not lost and is not going to behave as if he has. Elara looked at the ceiling for a brief moment with the expression of someone containing a response that the professional setting did not permit. The session was adjourned without resolution. In the corridor outside, Elara stood at the window and looked at the capital going about its ordinary business below, and thought about a woman she had never met who was somewhere in the northern mountains, and felt the specific, urgent weight of wanting something to happen quickly enough to matter. He had not planned to stay. He had climbed the mountain intending to find her, confirm she was alive, begin the conversation that needed to begin, and descend before nightfall to send Marin up with the medical assessment tools and the beginning of a proper welfare intervention. This was the plan of a man who was still, at the moment he formed it, thinking about the situation with a portion of his brain that had not yet fully understood that the situation did not respond to planning. By the time the afternoon light shifted to evening, and the fire had been rebuilt twice, and the mountain dark had settled around the small sanctuary with the absolute, insulating quality of high-altitude night, he had not descended. They had been talking for 4 hours. Not continuously, there were silences, some of them long. The kind that came from something said that required time before the next thing could arrive. But the conversation had the momentum of something that had been building for 12 days on his side, and he was beginning to understand, considerably longer on hers, the specific quality of a conversation between two people who have discovered that the other person thinks in a way that is recognizable to them, which is rarer than it seems and more significant. She had told him about her father, not in the way the investigator's report had reconstructed it, from the outside, assembled from other people's memories, but from the inside. The quality of it was entirely different. She described the Sunday morning of first feeling the fracture with the precise sensory language of someone who had revisited the memory so many times it had become completely clear. The kitchen table, the salt, her hand in the air. The specific impression of broken light that she had spent the next hour sitting with before she understood what she was supposed to do with it. She described the 11 weeks with the matter-of-fact honesty of someone reporting something that had simply happened rather than something they were claiming credit for. She described the moment her father asked how her day had been with the particular quietness of someone setting something precious down gently. He listened with the complete attention of someone who has been trying to understand a thing for a long time and has finally reached the source. He did not interrupt. He did not editorialize. He let her speak at her own pace, which was the measured, considered pace of a woman accustomed to conserving everything, including words. He told her about his mother. He had not planned to tell her. It was not the kind of thing he typically offered in conversations. It was personal history that he kept in the category of things he understood rather than things he discussed, which was where a great deal of his interior life resided. But she had told him about the kitchen table and her father, and the quality of the exchange required equivalent honesty, or it became an interview rather than a conversation. And he had decided somewhere in the third hour that he did not want an interview. His mother had been a quiet woman with a gift she had called intuition, and that he now understood. With 12 days of new context, may have been something more specific than that. She had spent her life taking care of people in the small, invisible ways that are most clearly visible only in their absence. She had died when he was 19. He had grieved her and then organized his grief, as he organized most things, into something functional, something that gave him information about what mattered without requiring him to sit with it indefinitely. He had thought, for 15 years, that this was adequate management. He was beginning to understand that adequate management and actually knowing something were different categories. Thessaly listened to this. When he finished, she was quiet for the specific moment of someone who is considering whether to say the true thing or the kind thing, and has determined they are the same thing. She said, "You have been managing your understanding of your mother the same way you managed your understanding of your kingdom, from a sufficient distance to see the shape without the cost." He sat with that. It was accurate. It was the kind of accurate that requires a moment before it can be responded to. He said, "Yes." She said, "That is something that can change." He asked, "How?" She said, with the quiet certainty of someone who has personal data on the subject, "You get close enough to feel the cost. And then you stop filing it and start carrying it. It is heavier, but it is more honest." They sat in the mountain dark with the fire and the herbal smell and the specific quality of silence that exists at altitude, where the world below has receded far enough to stop making its demands. And he thought about getting close enough to feel the cost and what that looked like in practice, and whether he was already in the process of learning it. He thought he might be. He asked her, eventually, about the bond, about what Marin had explained, the resonance signatures, the network, the directional pull toward her location. She was quiet when he described it. He had the impression she had not known about the aggregate behavior of the signatures, that she had understood the individual traces she left in her work, but had not known they were communicating with each other, building something connective across the kingdom's full geography. She said, "They are still reaching toward me." He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. He watched her face in the firelight, the silver hair, the lines, the eyes that were entirely present and slightly too bright in the way of someone whose body is running a deficit they have decided not to discuss. He said, "Marin has a proposal. For your condition. I want to tell you about it, and I want you to hear it before you decide whether to refuse it." She looked at him. There was something in her expression that was not quite humor, but lived in the same neighborhood. The expression of a woman who has been anticipating a version of this moment and is finding the reality of it simultaneously more and less alarming than she expected. She said, "I am listening." He told her about the reverse transference, Marin's theory, the resonance network, what 300 restored bonds, directed in concert toward a single source, might be able to accomplish. Thessaly was quiet through his explanation. When he finished, she was quiet for a longer time. He let her be quiet. He had learned, in 4 hours, that her silences were working silences, that she was doing something in them, arriving at something, and that interrupting them was the wrong choice. She said, "You cannot ask them to do that." He said, "I am not asking them. I am telling them what is possible and letting them choose." She said, "They will say yes." He said, "I know." She looked at him with the full, careful attention of someone encountering something they need to assess precisely because it matters. He held her gaze with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who has decided to be exactly where he is. She said, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "Because you needed it done, and I can do it, and I have not found a sufficient reason not to." She recognized her own words. He watched her recognize them, a brief, involuntary shift in her expression, something that moved through quickly and was managed back to stillness, but not quickly enough to miss. She looked at the fire. She said, "That is not a fair thing to say." He said, "No." He said, "I know." The fire burned between them. Outside, the mountain dark was total and still, the kind of dark that has no traffic in it. No competing light, nothing that insists on itself. The sanctuary held them in its old stone warmth and asked nothing of either of them. She did not say yes that night, but she did not say no. He did not descend. He sat in the chair beside the fire, and she sat in hers, and eventually both of them were quiet, and the quiet was the specific, inhabited quiet of two people who have said enough for one night and are willing to be in the same room with the rest of it. Somewhere in the deep middle of the night, she said, without looking at him, in the voice of someone saying something they have been carrying for a long time, I did not think anyone would come. He said, I know. He said, I am sorry it took me this long to look. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, you are here now. 3 words. Entirely simple. Carrying, in the specific quality of the way she said them, not as comfort, not as absolution, simply as fact, everything that needed to be said about what the past could not be changed into, and what the present still was. He stayed until dawn. Then he went down the mountain to send the riders. Maren had been awake since before dawn. She had the readings laid out on the camp table when Aldric descended, a careful, precise arrangement of documentation that told the same story from 4 different analytical angles, all of them arriving at the same conclusion with the convergent certainty of evidence that has been checked against itself and found consistent. She looked at his face when he emerged from the path. She read it with the practiced efficiency of a physician who has been observing this particular patient for 12 days and has developed a reliable diagnostic vocabulary for his expressions. She said she agreed. He said, not exactly. She did not say no. Maren considered this distinction and accepted it. She gestured to the documentation. He sat across from her in the early mountain light and listened while she explained the crisis in the precise, unsparing terms she had been reserving for this moment, the terms she had not fully deployed the previous day, because he had been about to climb the mountain, and she had calculated that full deployment was more useful now. On the other side, when a decision was actually in reach, Thessaly's life energy reserve had dropped below the threshold required to sustain her own bond structure. This was not a metaphor. The biological architecture that allowed Thessaly to exist within the resonance network, to feel her own connections, to maintain her own presence in the web of wolf bonds, was beginning to collapse under the weight of what she had given away. She was experiencing, Maren said, the early stages of the same process she had spent 11 years reversing in others. The fracture was not complete. It was progressing. Without intervention, it would complete within weeks, possibly less if she attempted the final repair. The intervention Maren proposed had no documented precedent. She said this clearly, without apology, because she considered intellectual honesty about the limits of her evidence more valuable than false confidence. What she was proposing was theoretical, derived from the logic of what she understood about resonance networks and the specific behavior of the signatures Thessaly had left in her work. The theory was, if 300 wolves, all bearing Thessaly's energy signature in their restored bond structures, were to direct a coordinated pulse of that energy back toward its source simultaneously, the aggregate might be sufficient to stabilize her reserve, to give back in concert what she had given individually. The logistics were considerable. 300 wolves distributed across the kingdom, many of them days apart. Simultaneous coordination required a timing mechanism and a communication network capable of reaching all of them within a narrow window. The resonance itself required alignment. Each wolf would need to actively direct their bond energy rather than simply possess it, which required instruction and willingness. Aldric listened. When she finished, he was quiet for the specific interval of a man calculating rather than deciding. The decision, she could read, had already been made, and what was happening now was the translation of decision into logistics. He said, send riders to every pack on the list. Today. Carry the medical documentation, Maren's instructions for the resonance direction, and a letter from me. The letter explains what is happening and what is being asked. It does not instruct. It informs. She asked, And if some of them decline? He said, then they decline. The choice is theirs. She began writing the rider orders. He went back up the mountain. Thessaly was at the window when he returned, standing rather than sitting, her cup empty on the table. Looking at the southern view, the mountain dropping away below the sanctuary's shelf into the wide, hazy distance of the kingdom's middle territories. She turned when he entered. She looked at his face with the same reading attention she had been directing at him since the previous afternoon. He told her about Marin's proposal in the full detail he had withheld the previous night, the specific physiological mechanics of her condition, the threshold Marin had identified, the timeline. He told her because she had said she was listening, and he had decided that listening deserved complete information rather than managed information. He watched her absorb the numbers the way she absorbed everything, quietly, with the full attention of someone who is receiving information rather than bracing against it. When he finished, she was still for a moment. Then she said, "You have already sent the riders." He said, "Yes." She looked at him. She said, "You were certain I would agree." He said, "I was certain you would not refuse something that had a real chance of working, once you had the complete information. That is different from certain you would agree." She considered this distinction with the same careful attention she gave to all his distinctions. She said, "It is a very fine line." He said, "Yes." She turned back to the window. He stood beside her. The kingdom stretched away below them, large and various and carrying, in 300 of its wolves, a piece of her that was even now, if Marin's theory was correct, orienting toward her location with the faint, persistent pull of something that knows where it came from. She said, "They will say yes." He said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I have spent 12 days talking to them. Because Corvin submitted 14 pages of testimony. Because Finn asked me to tell you he is using it well. Because the child, Senna, told me her papa talks about you sometimes. Because he wants to thank you even though he understands you did not want to be thanked. They will say yes because you gave them something irreplaceable, and they have been carrying a piece of you in their bond structures ever since, and they know it, and they want to give it back." Thessaly was very still beside him. He did not look at her directly. He looked at the view, giving her the privacy of the direction of his gaze while she managed whatever was happening in her expression. After a moment she said, in a voice that was controlled and slightly rough at its edges, "Finn is 19 years old." He said, "Yes." She said, "He should not have to." He said, "He wants to." She was quiet. He said, "You have spent 11 years deciding what people needed. Let them decide what they want to give." The mountain air moved between them, thin and cold, and carrying the particular clarity of altitude. She did not answer immediately. He waited. With the patience he had been developing over 12 days of learning that patience was what this particular situation required from him. Then, from somewhere below, from the camp at the mountain's base, carried upward by some quality of the mountain air he could not explain, a sound arrived. Marin's voice calling up the path. A single sentence, delivered with the contained excitement of a woman who does not permit herself excitement, but is currently managing a significant quantity of it. "The first response has arrived," Marin called. "It is from Corvin. He says, 'We are ready. Tell us when.'" Thessaly closed her eyes. She stood at the sanctuary window with her eyes closed and her hands loose at her sides, and something moved through her face that he did not try to name because it was too complete for a single name. She opened her eyes. She looked at the southern distance where Corvin was somewhere for days away, holding his restored bond structure and waiting. She said, "Tell him when." The responses came through the night and into the following morning. Marin tracked them at the camp below, recording each arrival with the methodical attention of a physician conducting the most unusual clinical trial of her career, sending confirmation back to each respondent, compiling the final count, building toward the moment when the number was complete enough to proceed. Riders returned from the nearest settlements. Resonance messages arrived through the pack network from farther ones. By dawn, 263 wolves had confirmed. By mid-morning, the count had reached 289. At the second hour past midday, Maren climbed the path and appeared at the sanctuary door with her documentation and her equipment and the expression of a woman who has arrived at something unprecedented and is managing her response to that with professional discipline and not entirely succeeding. She examined Thessaly at the table, brief, thorough, conducted with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned to read a body quickly and accurately. She recorded her findings without comment, which was itself a form of comment. And then she sat across from Thessaly and explained the protocol with the precision she brought to all medical communication. What would happen, in what order, at what intensity. What Thessaly should expect, and what she should do if the intensity exceeded manageable parameters. Thessaly listened with the focused attention of someone receiving instructions for a procedure she has agreed to and intends to execute correctly. She asked 2 clinical questions. Maren answered them. She asked nothing about the risk, because she had already assessed the risk herself. In the hours since Aldric had given her the complete information, and had arrived at a position of clear-eyed acceptance that was neither fearlessness nor resignation, but the specific equanimity of someone who has made a fully informed choice and is not going to second-guess it. The protocol required her to be seated, still, and as open as she could sustain for the duration of the simultaneous pulse. Maren had set the timing for dawn the following day, the moment when the resonance network was historically most active, when the bond frequencies across the kingdom ran strongest, when 300 wolves directing their energy toward a single point would meet the least resistance. Aldric asked if he could be present. Maren said the protocol did not require him to be absent. She said it with the careful neutrality of a woman who has decided that her medical authority extends to the procedure and not to the room's other occupants. He stayed. The night before the ritual passed in the sanctuary's particular quiet, the 3 of them present, each managing their version of the waiting. Maren reviewed her documentation. Thessaly sat at the window for a long time, looking at the dark, and then moved to the cot and slept with the total deliberate quality of someone who has decided that rest is preparation and is treating it accordingly. Aldric sat in the chair beside the fire and did not sleep and did not try to. Dawn came gradually in the specific way of mountain dawns, not a sudden arrival but a slow, incremental lightening. The dark becoming less dark by degrees until the sky was gray, and then the gray was lit from beneath by something warmer. Maren had the timing coordinated through the resonance network, a signal sent to every confirmed wolf at the designated hour, a collective breath before the collective act. She checked her equipment. She positioned herself at the room's edge, where she could monitor without interfering. She looked at Thessaly. Thessaly was seated at the center of the room, in the chair they had moved from the table. Her hands in her lap, her spine straight, her eyes open. She looked entirely present. She looked, Aldric thought, the way she had looked in every testimony he had read, the way Corvin had described her and Finn had described her and the elder in the Highlands had described her, focused and calm and entirely somewhere specific, not performing stillness but genuinely inhabiting it. She looked at him once, briefly, before Maren signaled the start. The look was not dramatic. It was simply present, the look of someone who is aware of another person in a room and wants them to know it. He held her gaze. He said nothing. Neither did she. Maren said, "Now." For a moment, nothing appeared to happen. Then it arrived. He could not see it. He had no gift that would allow him to see resonance energy moving through the air. But he could see her, and what he saw was unmistakable. The change began in her face, a quality of warmth arriving. The way warmth arrives when you step from cold into a lit room, visible in the slight relaxation of muscles that had been carrying tension he had not known was there. Her hands, which had been still in her lap, opened slightly, the fingers spreading, palms up. The involuntary posture of someone receiving something. Then more. She inhaled sharply. Her eyes widened. She was feeling something that the sharp intake of breath was inadequate to contain, something arriving at a volume her body was not prepared for. Not painfully, but with an intensity that bypassed careful management and simply was. He understood, watching her face, that she was feeling each of them. Individually, within the flood of returning energy. She could distinguish the specific signature of each wolf she had healed, their individual resonance. Recognizable to her after the intimacy of the repair work, each one distinct and specific and present. 300 people, directing everything they had been given back toward the person who gave it. Not as an abstraction, as a specific, personal act of recognition. Her eyes filled. She did not close them. She sat in the chair at the center of the sanctuary and let it arrive. All of it, every signature, every specific and individual warmth, with the complete openness of someone who has spent 11 years giving and has just discovered, for the first time, what receiving this fully feels like. Maren was monitoring. Her hands were steady over her equipment. Her face was not entirely steady. It lasted several minutes. When it ebbed, not abruptly but in the gradual, settled way of a tide completing rather than withdrawing, the sanctuary was quiet in a different way than it had been before. Fuller, somehow, as if something had entered and remained. Thessaly sat very still for a moment after the pulse ended. Maren crossed to her. She took readings with the quick efficiency of someone who needs data and needs it now. She looked at the results. She looked at them again. She made the sound she had been disciplining herself not to make for the entire duration. A single short exhale. The compressed release of 12 days of sustained professional tension. She said it worked. The reserve is stabilizing. Thessaly looked up at her. Her face was wet. She did not appear to notice or to find it important. She said, all of them came. Maren said, all 300. The final 7 confirmations arrived during the night. Thessaly was quiet. She looked at her hands, the thin, silver-haired hands that had done 300 repairs and had just received, for the first time, something in return. She looked at them with the expression of someone encountering something familiar that has just become entirely new. Aldric crossed the room to her. He crouched beside the chair so that he was at her level, not standing over her, not at a formal distance. Simply present at the same height as someone who wanted to be met rather than managed. He said quietly, Finn says he is using it well. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob but contained elements of both, the specific, involuntary sound of someone whose emotional management has been overridden by something too large for the usual channels. She pressed one hand briefly to her mouth. She steadied. She looked at him. He said, every one of them. She nodded. One small, complete nod. The nod of someone receiving something they had not known they needed and finding it. In the receiving, more significant than anything they had prepared for. The great hall had been configured for full assembly only a handful of times in Aldric's reign. Moments of sufficient significance that the ordinary working apparatus of court governance was insufficient and something more complete was required. The installation of new pact treaties. The formal declaration of the northern border settlement. The death of the prior king. It was configured for full assembly now. Every council member was present. Every senior court official. Pack representatives who had traveled at significant speed from across the kingdom, many of them names from the ledger. Wolves who had received Aldric's rider and understood. From the nature of the summons, and from what they had been asked to do 3 days prior at dawn. That what was happening in this assembly was connected to the thing that had happened to them on a Tuesday morning 11 years ago, or 6 years ago, or 4 months ago, in a small room in a pack settlement. When a quiet woman with silver hair had sat with them and rebuilt what they had been told could never be rebuilt. Thessaly had come down from the mountain 2 days after the ritual. She had descended on her own terms, at her own pace. With Marin walking beside her and Aldric following at a distance she had indicated was appropriate, which he had respected without comment. The descent had taken twice as long as the ascent. She had stopped several times, not from weakness, or not only from weakness, but with the specific quality of someone who had been in a still place and was re-entering the world carefully, giving herself time to arrive rather than simply appearing. She had ridden to the capital in the company of Marin and the 2 guards and Aldric, who had ceased, somewhere on the mountain, to behave with the formal distance of a king conducting official business, and had not resumed it since. She was not certain when the shift had happened. She was not certain it mattered. In the capital she had been given a suite of rooms, actual rooms, not the small single allocation of a visiting aide, and had slept for 14 hours and woken to find a formal court robe laid out by a palace attendant who had clearly received detailed instructions about the quality and fit of the garment. She had looked at the robe for a moment. She had put it on. She entered the great hall through the main doors. Not the side entrance. Not the servants' corridor that fed into the hall through the door sized for invisibility. She had learned of the side entrance's existence from the palace attendant who had laid out the robe, who had helpfully mentioned it as the standard entry point for non-council visitors to formal assemblies. She had thanked the attendant and used the main doors. She moved slowly. Her body was recovering with the specific, non-linear quality of recovery from something significant, better than it had been, not yet what it was going to be. Variable in the way of systems that are rebuilding rather than simply resting. She had decided she was finished pretending her body was other than it was, which meant she moved at the pace her body currently permitted and did not apologize for it. The hall watched her enter. She was aware of being seen, completely, with the full visual attention of a room full of people who had been told something about her and were now encountering her in person, and were doing the specific recalibration of human beings who have received information about someone and are now updating it against the actual thing. She was aware of the silver hair and the lines and the way her body moved with the careful economy of someone who had been conserving everything for a very long time and was only now beginning to learn what it felt like to have something to spare. She did not adjust herself for the room's attention. She walked at her pace through the full length of the hall to the position that had been indicated to her, not the council table, not the petitioner's position, not any of the standard assigned locations of the great hall's formal geography, but the center of the floor, in the open space before the throne platform, which was not a standard position at all and had been designated specifically for this occasion. Lord Vern was at the council table with his documentation arranged before him. He began speaking as she reached her position, his argument polished to a high shine after 3 days of enforced waiting. Every procedural objection organized into its most persuasive sequence. She let him speak. She stood and listened with the complete, patient attention she brought to everything she thought deserved to be fully heard before it was responded to. He was thorough. When he finished, the silence that followed had the specific quality of a room that is waiting for something and has some uncertainty about what form it will take. She spoke into it. Her voice had recovered from the roughness of the mountain days and carried clearly in the hall's acoustics. She did not speak loudly. She did not need to. She spoke with the certainty of someone who has thought about what they are going to say for considerably longer than the 3 days since the summons arrived, who has, in some sense, been preparing this statement for 11 years. She described her gift without apology and without dramatization, in the plain language of documented fact. She described the work without self-pity and without the performance of sacrifice, because it had not been sacrifice in the sense of something given up, but in the sense of something given, which was different. She described what she had needed that she had not had, not for herself, she said, with the honest clarity that had characterized everything she said, because the specific costs to herself were no longer fully reversible, and the conversation about them was therefore primarily historical. She described what she needed established for everyone who came after her. She named the gaps, the registry, the welfare assessment, the compensation structure, the legal recognition. She named them with the precision of someone who has been living inside the gaps for 11 years and knows their exact dimensions. She said, "I am not asking for recognition of what I did. The work was done. It does not require recognition to have been real. I am asking for the establishment of a system that ensures no one who comes after me has to make the choice I made between doing necessary work and being visible enough to be protected while doing it. Those should not be a trade. They have been a trade for a very long time. I am asking the council to end the trade." The hall was very still. Vern opened his mouth. He had a procedural response prepared. It was technically accurate and completely inadequate. Aldric looked at him from the throne with the specific, complete attention of a king who has been paying full attention to everything in this room and is now directing that attention at one person in particular. Vern closed his mouth. Aldric stood. Aldric spoke without notes. This was observed and remarked upon afterward by every person present, because it was sufficiently unusual to be notable. He was a king known for prepared addresses, thorough, precise, leaving no interpretive gaps. The preparation was a form of respect for the audience, he had always believed. The assumption that what was being said mattered enough to be said correctly. He spoke without notes because what he had to say could not be prepared. It had been accumulating for 12 days on the road, and 2 days on a mountain, and one specific night in a sanctuary where a woman with silver hair had told him things that had revised his understanding of himself and his kingdom in ways that prepared language could not yet contain. He began with himself. Not with the institution, not with the systemic failure, not with the administrative language of a king identifying a policy gap and announcing a correction. He began with the specific, personal account of a man who had held a piece of paper with a woman's name on it and initialed it and moved to the next item, and what that choice had meant, and what it had cost the woman whose name he had not looked at closely enough to see. He said, "I want to be precise about the nature of the failure I am describing, because precision matters when the failure has a human cost. This is not a systemic failure that occurred because the system was inadequate. The system was inadequate because the people responsible for it, I among them, did not look at it from the perspective of the people it was failing. We looked at it from above, from the position of people for whom it functioned adequately, and we saw adequacy and called it sufficient. It was not sufficient. It was never sufficient. The evidence of its insufficiency was traveling this kingdom for 11 years. In the person of a woman who was doing what our system should have been doing, alone, without protection, at a cost that our system should have been preventing. The room was quiet with the specific quality of people confronting an accurate statement delivered, without the softening that power usually applies to its own failures. He described Thessaly's work with the specificity of someone who had spent 12 days learning it, and was not going to allow it to be abstracted into something manageable. He read names from the ledger, not all 300, but enough. Corvin, Petra, Oscar, whose daughter Senna had opened the door and asked if he was here about the lady who fixed her papa. Finn, who was 19 years old and had asked Aldric to tell her he was using it well. He read the names in the same voice he used for everything that mattered, steady, direct, giving each name the weight of a person rather than a data point. He described the cost. He used Marin's numbers, 60 to 80 years of accelerated biological aging, sustained over 11 years by a woman who was 31 years old. He did not editorialize. He let the numbers speak, because the numbers were more devastating than anything he could add to them. He said, "I am describing a woman who gave 60 to 80 years of her life to this kingdom, who did it without contract, without compensation commensurate with the cost, without the protection of any registry or welfare framework that might have monitored what she was giving and intervened before the giving exceeded what any person should be asked to bear. She did not ask us to look. We did not look anyway. Both of those things are true, and neither of them resolves the other. Vern submitted a procedural objection. He did it with the professional composure of a man who understood he was operating in increasingly hostile territory and had decided that consistent procedure was his best remaining position. Aldric acknowledged the objection. He said, "The objection is noted and entered into the formal record." He said, "I am overruling it." 2 sentences, delivered without heat, without the performance of authority, with the flat, complete certainty of a man who has decided something and is not going to be moved from it by procedural friction. He announced 4 actions. He delivered each one with the precision of someone who has been constructing them carefully and wants there to be no ambiguity about their scope or their binding nature. First, a royal registry of Omega gifts, mandatory and permanent, with welfare protections embedded in the registration process itself, not added afterward, not optional, built into the structure from its foundation, so that registration and protection were the same act rather than separate ones. Second, a crown compensation structure for all documented undisclosed service, going back 20 years, calculated based on the actual cost to the individual rather than the administrative convenience of the institution receiving the benefit. Third, a formal investigative commission, chaired by Alara, tasked with identifying every case in the administrative record that bore the pattern of Thessaly's situation, an Omega with an unusual gift performing essential service without adequate protection or compensation, and producing a complete accounting within 1 year. Fourth, the establishment of the Healer's Sanctuary Council with full legal standing, Omega representation as a formal requirement rather than a courtesy, and the authority to set and enforce welfare standards across all designated healing roles in the kingdom. He paused. He looked at Thessaly, who was standing at the center of the great hall floor with the same stillness she had brought to everything since he had found her on the mountain, the stillness of someone who is fully present and entirely ready. He said, "Thessaly will chair the Sanctuary Council. This appointment carries a formal royal designation that supersedes any prior classification in the legal record. It is permanent, it is salaried, and it is established by royal decree rather than council vote, which means it does not require council approval to take effect." Vern looked at his documentation. He looked at it for a long moment. He set it aside. Alara, across the table, did not look at the ceiling. She looked directly at Thessaly with the expression of a woman who has been arguing for something in an empty room for a long time and has just heard it said aloud by someone with the authority to make it real. The vote was called on the formal establishment of the 4 actions as royal policy, not on whether to implement them. That was already decided by decree beyond the council's authority to prevent. The vote was on the council's formal endorsement, which was politically significant without being structurally required. It was not unanimous. 8 members voted in favor. 3 abstained. Vern voted against, which was his right, and which he did with the professional composure of a man recording his position for the historical record without expectation of changing the outcome. 8 was a majority. Alara called the result. She said, "The motion carries." The great hall received this in a silence that was not absence but presence, the presence of something that had just shifted, irrevocably, in the structure of how the kingdom understood its own obligations. Thessaly stood at the center of the floor and felt the weight of it settle around her, not on her, not as a burden, but around her, the way a frame settles around something it has been built to hold. She felt the resonance of the hall, the bonds of the wolves present, the specific signatures of the ones she knew, Corvin in the 3rd row, his steady warmth unmistakable. A woman from the Highland pack whose bond structure she had rebuilt in a cold room 2 winters ago. 2 others she recognized from their signatures without being able to place their faces at this distance. They had come. They were here. 300 wolves across the kingdom had woken at dawn 3 days ago and directed everything they had been given back toward her. And some of them had then traveled to the capital and were standing in this room. She had spent 11 years telling each of them that what she asked was only that they use it well. They were using it well. She looked at Aldric. He was looking at her with the full, specific attention that was simply how he was when something mattered entirely to him. She held his gaze with the calm, complete openness she had been practicing, imperfectly and progressively, since a night in a mountain sanctuary when he had used her own words back to her and she had found, to her considerable surprise, that she did not have a sufficient reason to refuse. She nodded. One small, decisive nod, not yielding, not diminishing, simply arriving. The nod of a woman who has crossed a very long distance and recognized where she is. The Sanctuary Council held its first working session on a Wednesday morning in a room that Thessaly had chosen herself. Not the Great Hall, not the formal deliberation chamber where Vern had assembled his emergency session and constructed his 3-pillar argument. A medium-sized room on the palace's second level with adequate light and a table that seated 12. Without crowding, and a window that looked onto the inner courtyard rather than the ceremonial approach. A working room, the kind where things got done rather than announced. She had been chairing it for 6 weeks before the capital fully understood that the Sanctuary Council was not going to operate as a symbolic body. The first indication was the registry design. Thessaly had submitted her specifications to the council's administrative staff in the first week, a document of 32 pages that covered every aspect of the registration process with the intimate knowledge of someone who understood, from the inside, every way such a system could fail the people it was meant to protect. The administrative staff had reviewed it and flagged 17 points as requiring further discussion before implementation, which was standard procedure for significant policy documents. She had scheduled the discussion for the following morning. All 17 points were resolved by midday. The staff had the final specifications by the afternoon session. They had not encountered a chair who arrived at discussions with the answers already prepared, not as positions to defend, but as conclusions drawn from evidence she had been accumulating for 11 years and could produce, for any point of contention, in specific documented detail. The registration process she designed had 4 components: voluntary declaration, gift assessment conducted by a certified independent physician, welfare baseline documentation, and a standing monitoring schedule with assessment intervals determined by the severity and cost profile of the declared gift. The monitoring was not optional after registration. This was the point on which she had anticipated the most resistance and received it, from 2 council members who argued that mandatory monitoring imposed on voluntary registrants was a contradiction in terms. She had prepared for this argument. She said, "The monitoring is not imposed on the registrant. It is imposed on the institution that benefits from the registrant's gift. The registrant has the right to be monitored. The institution has the obligation to provide the monitoring. The distinction matters." The 2 council members had exchanged a look. One of them had said, "That is an unusual framing." She had said, "It is an accurate one." The compensation structure took longer. The mathematics of retroactive compensation for undisclosed service were genuinely complicated, not in the ways Vern had argued, which were strategic complications dressed as procedural ones, but in the ways that arose from trying to calculate fair payment for things that had no prior market price because they had never been formally recognized as services. She worked through it with the council's financial specialists over 3 weeks, building a framework that used the cost to the provider rather than the benefit to the institution as its primary measure. This was unusual. Every existing compensation framework she had encountered used the institutional benefit as the baseline. She said, Institutional benefit is difficult to quantify and easy to minimize. The cost to the provider is documented in the body. It is not abstract. The financial specialists had worked with that framework. It had produced numbers that were larger than the institution preferred and smaller than the actual cost in human terms, which she acknowledged openly as an imperfect resolution of an imperfect situation and moved on, because imperfect resolutions achieved were more valuable than perfect ones debated indefinitely. Ilara's investigative commission, operating in parallel, had identified 31 additional cases in the administrative record bearing the pattern she had described, omegas with unusual gifts performing essential service without adequate protection or acknowledgement. 12 of those cases were historical, the wolves no longer living. Thessaly read each of those 12 files herself, alone, in the evenings, and gave each of them the attention of someone who understood that being too late to help was not the same as being too late to acknowledge. 19 were current. Of the 19, 7 were in active situations that constituted immediate welfare concerns. She personally oversaw the intervention in each of those 7 cases, not because protocol required it, but because she understood that the people conducting the interventions needed to understand what they were intervening in. And that understanding was best transmitted by someone who had lived it. Through all of it, Aldric was present. He did not chair the council. He did not lead the sessions or override her positions or insert the authority of the throne into the council's working process. He attended sessions when she invited him, which was not always but was more often than either of them had initially anticipated, because she had discovered that his particular quality of attention, the kind that saw things fully and responded to what was actually there rather than what was expected, was useful in council discussions that required someone to notice when an argument was being made in good faith versus when it was being made for the historical record. He brought her tea without being asked, which she had noted the first time it happened and had not commented on, which he had correctly understood as acceptance. He had developed a reliable sense of when a session had run past the point of productive return, the specific moment when her precision began to have a slightly sharper edge than it had at the session's start, which was the only outward sign of her fatigue. He would suggest, with the diplomatic indirectness of a man who had learned that direct suggestions in her direction were received as directives and refused, that the agenda might be continued the following morning. She always knew what he was doing. She usually agreed, because he was usually right about the moment. On the evening the registry's first enrollment opened, she was in the council chamber reviewing the final implementation documentation when the first confirmation arrived, a resonance message from a wolf in the Eastern Territories, a woman named Dara whose gift had been described to her family as strange and to herself as shameful, and who had heard about the registry from a pack member and had enrolled within the first hour of the window opening. Dara's message said simply, "I registered today. I have never told anyone what I can do before." It felt like putting something down that I had been carrying for a long time. Thessaly read the message at the council chamber table with the documentation spread around her and the evening light coming through the window at a low, amber angle. She read it twice. She sat with it for a moment. Aldric appeared in the doorway. He had learned to read the quality of her stillness, the difference between the stillness of concentration and the stillness of someone sitting with something significant. He crossed to the table and read the message over her shoulder without being invited, which was the kind of liberty she had been allowing him to take progressively, without announcement, over the past weeks. He said nothing. He stood beside her and read the message and understood what it meant and gave it the silence it deserved. After a moment, she said, 43 enrolled today. The first day. He said, 43 people who will not have to carry it alone. She looked at the message. She thought about Dara, in her eastern pack, having told someone what she could do for the first time, having put something down she had been carrying. She thought about what that felt like. She knew precisely what that felt like. From the specific angle of someone who had only recently learned it herself. She folded the message carefully. She placed it in the council's formal record, which was where it belonged, where it would be preserved as documentation of the first enrollment in the history of the Royal Registry of Omega Gifts. The first name in a record that would grow, she intended, until it was large enough to make the conditions that had produced her own situation structurally impossible. She looked at Aldric. He was watching her with a quiet, full attention that was simply his, that she had stopped finding alarming and had started finding, in the specific and private way of things that are admitted only after they become undeniable. Something she oriented toward the way the wolves' restored bonds had oriented toward her across the mountain range. She said, "There is still a great deal to do." He said, "Yes." She said, "The compensation framework needs another review before it goes to formal implementation." He said, "Tomorrow." She said, "And the monitoring schedule intervals for high-cost gifts need to be revisited. The current thresholds are conservative in the wrong direction." He said, "Also tomorrow." She looked at him. He looked at her. The amber evening light was doing what evening light does to rooms that contain things worth looking at. She said, "You are managing me." He said, "I am suggesting that the documentation will still be here in the morning, and you have been working for 11 hours. She said, "That is the same thing." He said, with the specific quality of dryness he had been deploying with increasing frequency, and that she had been finding, with increasing frequency, genuinely funny. "I am aware of that." She almost smiled. It arrived and was real, and she did not catch it before it showed, which was something that had been happening more often than she had initially budgeted for. She gathered the documentation. She filed it with the methodical care of someone who had been trained by 11 years of working, without institutional support to treat her own records as the only backup that existed. She looked around the council chamber, the working room she had chosen, the table that seated 12, the window onto the courtyard. She had built something real here. Imperfect, ongoing, requiring defending and refining, and the sustained attention of people committed to it. Real. She walked with Aldric out of the council chamber and through the palace corridor toward her rooms. And neither of them spoke much, and the quiet between them had the settled, inhabited quality of a quiet that belongs to people who have been in each other's company long enough that silence is a form of conversation rather than its absence. 2 years after the mountain, the registry had enrolled 341 Omega healers. Thessaly knew the number because she checked it every Monday morning, the first thing before the council session, with the specific attention of someone monitoring something they built and intend to keep building for as long as they are able. The number changed every week. It had never in 2 years changed downward. New names arrived from settlements she had not yet reached, from wolves who had heard about the registry from other wolves, from young Omegas who had grown up being told that what they could do was strange or dangerous or best kept quiet and had encountered, through the network of the restored bonds or through a cousin or through a rider who came to their pack with information, the knowledge that there was now a place that would receive what they were without requiring them to hide it first. The Thessaly Healers' Sanctuary sat at the capital's edge on land that had been administrative storage, converted, under her direct specification, with the specific insistence of someone who understood the difference between a building that was designed for the people inside it and a building that was designed to impress the people outside it. It looked like neither a palace annex nor an institution. It looked, she had been told by Marin on the day of the opening, like a place where someone had thought carefully about what people needed when they arrived somewhere carrying something heavy and had built accordingly. 12 of the registry's 341 enrolled healers had received welfare interventions in the past 2 years, situations where the monitoring schedule had identified a cost profile approaching critical levels, and the council had acted before the crisis rather than after it. 12 wolves who had not had to climb a mountain alone and leave a ledger on a windowsill. 12 situations that had been caught by the system she had designed, because she had designed it specifically to catch them. With the knowledge of someone who understood from the inside exactly what catching looked like and what missing looked like. 3 bond fractures, assessed as permanent by the kingdom's best physicians, had been successfully repaired by registry-enrolled healers in the past year. Each repair had been conducted with full documentation, full consent, full welfare monitoring, and full compensation. Each healer had been assessed before and after, their reserves tracked, their recovery supported. None of them had worked alone. None of them had had to. Thessaly stood at the sanctuary window on a Tuesday morning in early autumn and watched the current class of enrolled healers in the courtyard below, 11 of them, ranging from 17 to 30. They were in the middle of a session with one of the sanctuary's senior physicians, a woman named Ines who had been one of the 43 first-day enrollees and who had proved, in the 2 years since, to possess both an extraordinary gift and an extraordinary capacity for teaching it to others. They were learning the names of their own gifts, saying them aloud in the courtyard in the morning light, with the specific quality of people doing something for the first time that they have been afraid to do for a long time. Tentative and then less tentative, the words becoming more real as they were spoken. The speaking of them making possible a kind of solidity that the silence had not. She watched them with the feeling she had been developing. Slowly and with the careful attention she brought to everything she wanted to understand precisely for the past 2 years. It was not straightforward happiness, which she had always been suspicious of as a category, too simple, too final, not accurate to the texture of what good things actually felt like from the inside. It was something more complex, something that contained the weight of